Today I'm going to show you how to use watercolor paint and the techniques artists use on their watercolor. Before I begin, set yourself up. I have a cup of water, watercolor paint, a towel, and a round brush. Also, make sure that you're holding the brush correctly. Do not hold it at the tip of it as if you're writing. Hold it in the middle like as if you are drawing, like how I had taught you. You're also going to be using more of the tip of the brush when you are painting. Do not scrub the paint like I'm showing you. Make sure that you use the tip of the brush. So now, what you're going to do is you're going to get your brush wet and then dip it in the pigment. And when you're doing this, this is how you will determine how much pigment you want or how much water you want. So as you can see, I'm pushing the paint onto the paper using the tip of the brush. So as I said, if I add more water, it's going to change the value of the pigment. We use the white of the paper to help us show that. So what makes watercolor so difficult is the process of using the water with the pigment. And it's very difficult for beginners for that reason. Now I'm going to show you the 6 techniques. We have flat wash, gradation, wet on wet, wet on dry, dry brush, and then dry on wet. First technique will be the flat wash. Flat wash is an even application resulting in a solid color. I will add water to the paper first, and now I'm going to add water to the pigment, and then I will apply the paint across the paper. As you can see, I am going from left to right. If you're right-handed or left-handed, you could go from right to left. But the key is that you want to stay in a nice, consistent, smooth brush strokes so that it does not look like there's any type of change. You also don't want to show any type of brush strokes either. So as you can see, I'm just kind of adding a little water here and there just to continue. Now I'm going to go on to my second technique. This will be the gradation. Remember, anytime push pause if I'm going too fast. Watch it all the way through if needed. With this technique, we'll be showing value. So I'll be starting with more pigment at the top, and then I'm going to push it down, and I'm going to kind of clean my brush, add a little bit more water so it's less pigment, and then I add that water to that, and as you can see, now I'm going to have that gradation, kind of what I had shown you earlier. So like I said, I kind of rinsed the brush, pulled the paint, added a little bit more. So we want to kind of look at the differences between the techniques. Notice how the change of the value. Now I'm going to go on to wet on wet. And what this is, and what I'm doing right now, is that I'm just creating certain areas of that rectangle with water. I'm not covering it all, just a certain amount. Okay? And what I'm now going to do is that I'm going to add orange to this. Okay? So I had to really make sure that my brush was clean of that blue pigment. Now I'm just going to really load up with a lot of water and then a lot of pigment. And as you can see, I'm just putting that on the water where I had placed on the paper. After I added the water, I will now load my brush again and continue with the same technique in these other areas. I may also pick up the paper, push it around so that the pigment may move around in the water. I have a little control of that, but not much. So again, this is why this is a little bit more difficult. So now before I start the dry brush technique, I'm going to create a flat wash on my wet on dry. I want the area to be dry before I show the complete technique. So again, I'm just doing that first technique that I started at the beginning. Now I'm going to go to the dry brush. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to really make sure that I'm going to dry my brush with my paper towel. Then I'm going to come to the blue, and I have to make sure that it's not much water in my brush. There may be still a little bit of it, like as I'm showing right now, but I have to then, if it's showing that, then what I want to do is add more pigment and less water so that I have this more of that dry look. This is a little bit easier because I have a lot more control with my pigment. I also can show texture with my brush strokes with this too. Now I clean my brush, and now I'm going to add some orange around it, creating a color scheme, complementary colors, as I'm using the orange, because now there's the orange and blue. Now what you have to be aware of is that you want to make sure that your blue is dry, because if it's not, if my orange mixes with the blue, it's going to turn more of a brown. That's what happens when you mix complementary colors. Now I'm going to clean my brush, and then once again I'm going to add the water to my paper like I did with the wet on wet. So just certain areas. I'm going to grab my orange, and I'm going to create that technique like I had done with the wet on wet. So I'm just kind of putting some of this orange in those areas where I had placed the water. Next, I'm going to dry the brush. So I'm going to have now that dry technique with the brush. So I really want to use my towel, get the water out of there. And now I'm going to go to my green, and I'm going to really make sure I load this up with the pigment. So it's almost, less water in that pigment. And now as I come on to where I have the wet with the orange, I'm going to go ahead and paint that on top of it, which now is creating those lines to be more blurred. So even though that my brush is dried, it's going to have a little bit more of that blurred look to my edge. Now I'm going to go back to my fourth technique, wet on dry. With this, now that my paper has dried, I'm going to really load up my brush with water and add it to the pigment. Now notice these lines are going to have a little bit more of that defined edge, unlike what I had with the dry on wet. So as you can see, you can kind of look at both of them and compare them. All right, so these were your 6 techniques you may apply to your watercolor painting. Okay, watercolor does dry fast, so you may flip your paper over and start again. Also, it cleans up very easily, so if you make any type of mess, you can just wipe it down and clean it up. My next video will be about the watercolor wheel, how to create it, and expectations.